Welcome to Thinking Deeply About Primary Education, the podcast that makes time and space to think about pedagogy, teaching and learning, professional development, anything of interest to time poor but enthusiasm rich primary teachers. This week, I'm joined by Shannen Doherty.
Pleasure to be back.
And Louise McLaughlin.
Pleasure to be back as well. Thank you for having me.
I've been very excited for this since we went through the first two parts of the Ofsted proposal document. And so eager to get through points 3 through 5. And so probably no time to waste. Point 3 is about inspection methodology. Shannen, I don't know if it seemed to work quite well last week. You sort of give us a brief précis of what was planned. I mean, it's quite lengthy, but what's the gist of what's going on with this proposal point?
So the gist is they want to reform inspection because they want to change the process and some of the focuses. Ultimately, they're going to keep the phone call to start with, although they do also mention a video call, which I haven't come across before. I don't know if anyone else has. I'd be really interested to hear, actually, if anyone who's listening has had like a 90-minute video call rather than a phone call. They're going to keep that because they think that that's a positive step in building relationships with the inspectors and the leaders, which I don't think is a bad thing. They're not having deep dives anymore, so there are no more subject deep dives. There is going to be greater flexibility in the way that they inspect. They said that it was taking up basically all of day one and often half of day two. So that's a day and a half of inspections given over to curriculum deep dives. And so instead of that, they're going to work with leaders to decide the focus areas, which should mirror the school's priorities. One thing that I thought was really interesting is that it said they do not want to add to leaders' workloads. So they will not expect any written evidence of how the school is meeting the different areas and what standards they're kind of grading themselves at, I guess. And the inspectors and leaders will work together to decide on the inspection activities, which I would like to see how that works in practice, because in theory, that sounds like a good move, a positive move, that inspectors and leaders are working together to shape the inspection. But in practice, I'm not sure how that's going to work, especially without the deep dives, where leaders may have had some input on deep dives before. I guess maybe they'll direct inspectors to the areas that they want to focus on that are a priority for their school. Not sure, but it feels like they're trying to make it a more collaborative process. Look, I'm being positive.
I've tried to zoom out quite a lot with this, looking at these proposals, because I think it's really easy to get bogged down in the colours and the how many areas. Is it 4? Is it 5? Is it 27? Actually, that reminds me, I was reading a fantastically written article by Dan Worth on the TES website. If anybody hasn't read it, it gives you the number of possible outcomes based on the number of categories and the number of judgment options, and it's absolutely bonkers, the numbers of possibilities. So that does form part of my views on this. I suppose my big picture view is the whole thing, this whole new proposal document seems to focus for me a lot on the what, which is the kind of the toolkits, and the how, which is this new methodology. And there's still quite a lot of what I was thinking about last week. There's still not very much enough for me about the why, like the why are we doing this, other than we're reacting to something really bad that happened a couple of years ago, and we know that it just generally needs to be better, without really genuinely engaging in a strong professional dialogue with a range of stakeholders. We said last week, it feels like just a lot of rebranding of the same stuff. It just feels like they've just moved some words around and put them in slightly different boxes in a slightly different format. So then zooming in kind of a little bit more, I think the fact that there are so many possible permutations really leads me to question the methodology. How can it be possible, I think, to judge so many categories, to gather evidence about so many different areas with so many possible judgment outcomes in a 2-day inspection? I think is my initial thought is that, you know, there's a lot of kind of, well, we'll talk about what the provider does well, we'll talk about what some challenges or issues might be, and we'll look at what is going really well, and we want to be consistent in how we grade providers, is one of the sentences. But I don't know how that's going to be possible with such a huge range of possible outcomes from an inspection.
I've just looked up that test article while you were talking so that I could look at the numbers, and it's bonkers. So 390,625 possible inspection outcomes, whereas the old system had a maximum of 256. However, if you are an early years or a sixth form provision, it jumps up to 1.9 million. If you are an all through school and you have both of those, it jumps up to 9.7 million. And then finally, because schools also face a binary met or not met safeguarding judgment, it comes to like 19.5 million possible outcomes, which I can completely agree with you. How can you? I would like to know how you can be consistent with your grading when there are that many outcomes. And the thing that I think is interesting is that you are going to get a grade on your report card for all of those areas, even though it's saying inspectors and leaders will work together to decide on the focus areas. So how are you then ensuring that you've got a valid judgment on those areas that aren't your focus areas? And I know it says for each area that the inspectors will start with secure, and they'll look at the secure statements, because we're going in from a this is what everyone should be doing kind of point of view. And as soon as inspectors are confident that an area is secure, then they'll either move on to find evidence that it's, you know, better than secure, or I guess move on to another area. I get that, and I think that's, you know, it's great that we start from that sort of strength-based point of view of we're secure, we'll look at this secure category. But there is something in that, isn't there, about how consistently can you grade if there are so many possible outcomes and if there are so many things to look at. And I think I got into work after the weekend where part one of this aired, and I had some conversations about the podcast because people had obviously listened, which is lovely. Hello, shout out Aquinas people. And we talked, a couple of us talked about the fact that the statements, the APP grid, as we are calling it, does offer a level of granularity that could be helpful. And I think, you know, there are obviously people who do think that the granularity is a good thing because it allows there to be more, I guess, more consistency of what we're saying is secure because we've laid out those statements. The worry for me, as I said this in the last episode, is we're adding extra levels of grading that don't really do anything else, like you said, Louise. They're just rehashing an old system. And it's not necessarily Ofsted that are the problem. I'm not saying they are the solution, but often what happens is people who are worried about how their school will be graded end up taking these things and turning them into a thing that just like spirals and spirals, and then suddenly it is more workload and they don't know how to get out of it. And I do worry that when we've got all of these potential outcomes and all of these different areas to judge, that something will be missed because you can't, I don't know how you can do that effectively in a couple of days, and B, that leaders are going to inevitably add to their own and their teachers' workloads. However, on a positive note, because I do think it's important that we see the light and the shade, I think the fact that they have said that they want consistency and that they recognise that that's been an issue and that they want it to be a process where inspectors and leaders work together is a positive thing. I would just really like to see an example of it. It would be really nice if they kind of, I don't know, at some point trialed this in some schools that were willing to have this new framework or new kind of reforms to the framework, and then that we could see that as like a training opportunity and watch videos of it rather than it just happened behind closed doors. But then you'd need schools to put themselves forward for it. But then I think with the old framework, schools did that, didn't they? They put themselves forward for it to have a go. So maybe it is something that will work. Who knows?
The actual substance of the statements is an issue too. If they were granular in the terms of being specific to what the schools needed to do, then perhaps that might be a valid argument. But it reminds me of the old statement where it was challenge all pupils, in mathematics or whatever, or find the right, and then there would be a list of the different pupil groups that you had to challenge. And it didn't really tell you much more. This was in the old teacher standards. Didn't really tell you much more about what that meant. So as an NQT or whatever, you were sitting looking at this thing going, okay, right, so I've got to challenge the pupils. Oh, how? And it's only then through the work that you do and the CPD you're provided with that you actually get to that point. And that was the vibe I got when I read through those statements. There's nothing actual that you could hang your hat on or sink your teeth into. I don't know what the appropriate metaphor is here, but I mean, for me, and like I say, we say we'll give them a deep dives going. I think it's a positive. I know a lot of teachers in small schools who have 3-4 subjects and who've recounted tales of being in an Ofsted inspection, being in meetings all of day 1 and half of day 2. So I think that's a positive in terms of workload. I think the fact that they mention that this came from sort of, I don't know what the exact phrase was because I don't have it open in front of me, but it was like in the field. This wasn't from the big listen. This was, we saw this in practice. So perhaps they've seen those teachers struggling, and perhaps they have seen that multi-academy trusts are an advantage when they can swoop teams in for deep dives. And, obviously you guys are both in a mat. I'm a fan of mats. I think mats work extremely effectively well. But when you have the capacity to bring in experts where these, where individual schools don't, I think that's an issue, or it's an imbalance in the system. So from that point of view, I'm really good to see them go. Now, Elliot Morgan earlier on this evening said to me, well, he liked that they had put a renewed focus on subjects. And I agree with him. I think the lever should have been pulled, but perhaps there's a better way to pull that lever as we move forward, if that makes sense. So I mean, that really stood out to me. And the fact that it was from in the field observations as opposed to a survey. The idea that you're going to be ticking things off until you find secure and then you move on to the next thing. That's a kind of leadership I've seen that's not really that effective because you're like just looking for the things in like it's the old inspections and the old observations. Basically ticked all the things off and then your lesson was outstanding. It reminds me of that. And I think the issue with this is that, yes, we've seen that doesn't work, but what we've proposed doesn't look like it's going to work. So maybe there is no thing that works. I mean, we talked about the possibility of whether it was possible to make these kind of judgments. Maybe we have to accept that my binary, safe or not safe, is the only valid option, but I don't want to make it all about me. Because I do also like that they've got every provider will have a nominated member of staff as a point of contact. Because I think that could be helpful. Because there are certainly inspections I've been part of where the team have been with you the whole time and talking to you and stuff like that. But they're equally, there are ones where you haven't really seen them and everyone's sort of wondering what's going on in school and stuff like that. So there were definitely 2 positives there. But I think the premise in general is flawed and that's where you're running into issues, because it doesn't matter what methodology you propose. It's like an insurmountable task. But I don't know if that's my bias speaking, or I mean, we've seen 5 EIFs since I started teaching in 2008, maybe at least maybe 6. So I don't know.
At the very end of the proposals page on the website here, we've got, in summary, our reforms mean we will make the following changes to the EIF and replace the section grading scale with the 5-point scale. Replace the section key judgments with the new evaluation areas. Replace the section what inspectors will consider with new information about a new methodology and links to the relevant toolkit. Bullet point 4, explain the purpose and intended impact of our education inspections. Why is this bullet point 4? Why isn't this why are we not upfronting with this? This is the purpose. This is what we want to do. This is what everything is all about. This. We put children and learners at the heart of everything we do. That's not how it comes across. That's not how this is set out. There's not a really clear, for me, there's just not a clear thread of the why. There's not enough clear, this is why we do things in the way that we do them, and this is what we want our inspection framework to achieve, and we think that this one does it better, because every time I read it, I just think, oh yeah, that's another way of saying that. I liked what you said, Kieran, about the the evidence gathering, something you mentioned there about, them sort of stopping when they get to secure. And I think, Shannen, you mentioned that as well. And I was just wondering how many pieces of evidence do you think we might need? Do you think it'll be 3? Will it be 6? How we like to gather evidence in multiples of 3 in schools, don't we?
Across a period of time as well. So you've got some of the stuff that happened in September, some of the stuff that happened this term. Got to spread it out.
Good point. Yeah, and if they then you might have to go back to last summer so that you've got, in case they don't come before the summer term.
Well, yeah, keep last summer's teachers just in case they come in the autumn term.
This is too upsetting. No, because it says, let me quote, somewhere it says, we will not expect written evidence to support each area or standard. So that does ask the question then, what will you expect? Because will you see, hold on, let me find all of the areas. Scroll back up. So you will have to see evidence of leadership and governance, curriculum, developing teaching, achievement, behaviour and attitudes, attendance, personal development and wellbeing, inclusion, early years, sixth form, if those apply, and safeguarding. So you'll have to see those in the 2 days, because they don't expect you to keep any written evidence and provide any written evidence and show any evidence. You're not having to gather evidence across the year in preparation for this. But then what will be acceptable evidence in those 2 days? It does say somewhere else later on, I think it's in section 4, it says something like if the inspectors feel like there hasn't been adequate evidence and their judgment is at odds with the leader's judgment or self-evaluation, then they will say, right, well, show us more evidence, or tell me who to talk to so I can see where you're coming from. But I do think it's pretty hard to see all of those things to the level that these statements say you need to in a 2-day inspection. And thinking about the statements, Kieran, I know you said that I've had a scroll through, and I think some of them kind of do hit the nail on the head, and then some of them I think are a bit too woolly. There was one in the developing teaching that I thought, oh, actually, that's the kind of thing that I'd look at when I'm working with schools. I'm never going to be able to find it now, but it was more specific. I think the problem is not necessarily the problem, but maybe something that Ofsted have found to be a barrier for them is that they always say that they have no preferred style, and that if you're an Ofsted inspector, you kind of leave your own baggage of how you would do it at the door, and you go in with this, well, I'll look at how they do it attitude. So I imagine they don't want to be seen to be being too specific and too granular and really saying what they want to see, for fear of like people coming back at them and saying, but you said there's no preferred style, and now in your statements it says XYZ. Part of me sometimes just wants to say, maybe we should all just agree with what good teaching and learning looks like and just write it down. And that's the sort of stuff that we're looking at, but they don't want to be seen to be explicitly telling people what to do, I suppose. I feel like there is some good in there. Like one of the statements that I saw, I think I found it now. Teachers check people's understanding systematically, identifying and remedying any gaps or misconceptions, and they give effective feedback and supports pupils to improve. That's like a clear set, like that's them saying, we expect you to be doing this, this, and this, which is quite nice. But then some of the other statements are a bit wishy-washy. And perhaps it's because this has been written fairly quickly, from what I can gather, because they were only just doing the big listen, and now they've got the big consultation.
Looking for the dates as well, when it's due to be potentially rolled out from.
November is quoted a lot.
It is, and the inspectors will have to then be retrained on what is quite a large looking new set of information, and some changes in language, and so making sure that happens successfully in a way which means that inspectors feel confident to make these consistent and more supportive judgments against a lot more staff, essentially. I personally see as slightly problematic as well. I think the sort of proposed date for rollout is a bit tricky.
So proposal 4 is changes to full inspections and monitoring inspections. So basically, Section 5 and Section 8, I think, is the parlance we use to describe them now. And no one's ever really sure if they're due a 5 or an 8, but someone's coming soon. So they say the monitoring visits are only going to focus on areas that need attention, and that if schools are really struggling, they're going to get 5 monitoring inspections within 18 months, unless the issues have been resolved earlier. And if after 5 monitoring inspections the school is still causing concern, we would conduct a full re-inspection. So there are no, what would they call it, ungraded, one day, now everything's going to be full inspection, or you're going to have these monitoring visits.
All inspections being sort of these full inspections makes sense. I do think that there was confusion from some leaders about whether or not they would get a full or an ungraded, and what that would look like. I know I certainly had a 1-day ungraded inspection 9 years ago, and then I've also had a 2-day ungraded inspection in the last few years, because I think they realised that 1 day was too short. And I've also definitely seen leaders who have been very confident that they're getting an ungraded because their last inspection was a full inspection and it was only 5 years ago, and then they've come back and had a full inspection and they have not been prepared for it. And you had, especially when it was announced that ungraded inspections wouldn't have deep dives in them, and that was fairly recent. I think you then had some leaders go, oh, it's okay because we won't have a deep dive anyway. And then they weren't ready. And I mean, that probably talks about a whole host of other issues with the system. But I do think that kind of, we're all having the full inspection, helps with ambiguity and helps with people knowing what things are going to be like. And with the monitoring visits, I think it's interesting. I think I said in the last episode, I'd much rather have more frequent visits than being graded for everything. Obviously, that's not an option apparently, but I think it will be interesting to see what the monitoring visits look like. I know they talk about it a little bit, and they talk about how it will be focusing on the areas that they've got as like attention needed or causing concern. But I'd love to know what the structure of monitoring visit will look like. Is it just like an inspection, but a lighter version just on those areas? Is it going to be the same person coming back and checking what your progress has been? I mean, I just want there to be, again, more kind of clarity on that. 5 in 18 months is quite a lot. And part of me is kind of saying, well, if they're done right, then it doesn't need to be a bad thing. But that's a big if. And we don't know what it's going to look like. What I will say is, I think it's interesting that they say in the monitoring visits that they'll provide reassurance, they'll celebrate kind of progress, and they'll also signpost for next steps, which feels a bit developmental because it's like, right, we're working together and these are the next things to work on and let's check on that next time. But I'd like to know more about how that will look and how that will feel. I also think the DfE proposing that the new RISE teams going in and using the information from monitoring visits to kind of work out what support is needed in schools is an interesting mechanism, because I'm not sure how I feel about the RISE teams. So I don't know how leaders will feel about a RISE person coming in and offering them support. Again, I guess it depends how it's done and who it is. But it's interesting. It feels like it could feel really full on. And then would you want to work in those schools if you knew that you were going to have 5 monitoring visits in 18 months? Is that going to make retention and recruitment an issue for those schools? You get some people who will just want to work in those schools, because you'll get people like me and probably a lot of us who go, oh, that school looks like it'll be interesting. That school's on a journey. Let's go there. But that kind of like, oh, you're under constant scrutiny could feel a bit scary, a bit full on, a bit stressful. Again, it depends how it's done.
I have had a similar thought about the fact that you know what you're getting, exactly what kind of inspection you'll receive and how often. It feels like a lot, though. We're all very, very aware of Ofsted backlogs and schools that have been left untouched for significant lengths of time. And it does feel like a huge undertaking to insist on a really precise number within a precise time frame, and whether or not that would actually be possible, or would you still have that kind of what's the term, the worried waiting schools, and now you might have it for the monitoring visits as well. Okay, well, we haven't had our 5 and it's been 18 months, what happens next? Or we should have had 6 within 2 years and we haven't, and then when's our re-inspection happening? And that school X down the road are due their next full inspection, but they can't go down there because they're still doing our monitoring inspections here. And it feels like a really big task, which great, brilliant, if it's possible. But I think we're all a bit jaded by experience, aren't we, of these things? And we've all seen that just doesn't happen. Like Ofsted just don't make it in time very often. As I mentioned last time, didn't come when I was on maternity leave. They were long overdue already. They still waited till I came back. I think within that as well, the fact that we've got, if after 5 monitoring inspections the school is still causing concern, we would conduct a full re-inspection, because that will help to make things better.
Yeah, what's the end game on that one?
But also, if you've done 5 monitoring visits and it's still causing concern, what's the impact of your monitoring visits? Surely that would cause concern.
That does cause me concern, yes.
I mean, we're already concerned, and it hasn't even started yet. So, I'll be finishing off my report card soon. Because I mean, I think you're right, Shannon. If you were getting 5 visits in 18 months, that's intense. And given that we have no reason to suspect that they won't be these high stakes, intense situations, and I know of schools. I mean, there are lots of us who like to take on a challenge when we go into schools and stuff. But I know schools that are fully propped up by supply teachers because of the challenging circumstances that they exist in. Like literally two form school with 14 supply teachers, and they change regularly because of the situation. So there isn't an endless supply of goodwill and virtuous teachers who want to make their mark on a school that's facing difficulties. Because we spoke last week about how we know how to improve schools, and we know we've, like you say, you mentioned mechanism, Shannon. We've got plenty of ways that we can structure that, but it just doesn't involve the inspectorate, and that's the issue here. I think it's the crux of all of this, is that the way to improve our schools in England doesn't necessarily have to involve them, and it's almost like this is a justification for their existence when really the question should have been, do we need this? Is it actually making a difference? And some honest answers would have been put front and center, I think, because the fact that data is coming back into the picture, even though it went because we know how unreliable that is, doesn't suggest that the monitor visits are going to be that effective, because we're not really thinking about what effective sort of support looks like and what effective judgment and evaluation looks like. So yeah, so I think you've done well to see the positives. But I think the crux of it is there's not necessarily a need for this organization, and they've so far fallen short of justifying why they exist and why they're going to be in schools more frequently than they have been. And Louise, I'm totally with you. You're talking like 6 months, 6 month lag at least from word on the street. And even then, if you were reasonably okay in your previous inspection, that could be much longer. So, practically, philosophically, it just doesn't seem like a workable solution, does it?
What's also interesting is that it says if a school was inspected before November 2025 and they had an overall RI judgment because they were inspected before the overall judgment was taken away, or they have key areas graded as RI or inadequate, I guess, then they will be included in the schools that are receiving monitoring. So you've got all of those schools and all the schools that they then come in and grade anything as attention needed or causing concern. And I think you're right. I think this will become somewhat unmanageable unless they recruit for more inspectors, or they use the RISE teams, or they just have people who come in and do the monitoring visit. So maybe you're not someone who does a full inspection, but you do a monitoring visit. But then it also says that they'll try to use the monitoring inspection itself to produce an updated report card. So treat it as if it were a full inspection, but this might not always be possible. Which I then think makes me think that some leaders will see each of those monitoring visits as another inspection and then lay that kind of pressure onto their teams. And it shouldn't be that. But I do think ultimately, Kieran, you're right. There is a large proportion of the profession who maybe don't see the need for the inspectorate in its current form or its new form. And culturally, I think there's quite a big shift that has to happen for people to really see the worth in it. And I don't know how ready Ofsted are to make that shift happen. And I'm talking as someone who has only ever had positive Ofsted experiences. Not necessarily that we've always come out really well, but that I have felt comfortable and respected. And I mean, I'm looking at their core values: professionalism, courtesy, empathy, and respect. And I can say that every time I've had an Ofsted inspection, full, ungraded, whatever they were, I have felt like they've been professional and courteous and they've been respectful and they've shown empathy. But I know probably for every one of me, there's probably 10 other people who will tell you a really horrible story. And so I think there is a huge cultural shift that has to happen in our profession, which has to come from Ofsted proving that this is going to feel different and be different. And I guess like me trying to find positives, one, because I felt like I was such a negative Nelly last week, but also two, because I feel like surely they've done this because they want there to be a change, and not just because they felt pressure to listen. And some people would say they haven't really listened, but surely they want to move towards a place where we work together better, and that they do drive school improvement because that's what they want to do, I guess. I'd love to go through one of these and feel it and know what it should be like. But it does come with a lot of questions and a lot of potential issues. And I'm not sure we're ready for it as a profession for this change, a change that's coming. Like, I know it's been, gosh, nearly 5.5 years since they started inspecting on the last inspection frame, the current inspection framework, which actually is quite a long time. But I don't know, I just think there's probably something that could have been done that was more radical than this. And because it looks like the same sort of stuff boxed up slightly differently, people are not going to buy into it. We're proof of that. Last week we were not buying into the name changes, the grade changes, the areas that they're looking at. I think there'll just be people that see it as a really negative thing, and a doing to, not doing with, and an accountability thing that puts lots of pressure on people, which isn't really solving the problem. Like you said, Louise, this came about because of a really tragic thing, and I'm not really sure they're solving that problem.
No, and when you're saying, I totally see what you're saying, and like, I don't consider myself to be in the abolish Ofsted camp, but I just logically think about it. I don't see the point. I don't see that they've managed to justify their existence, or that these changes will actually help to justify their existence. So until surely the proof, or the burden of proof, should be on them, and the sort of the mark has not yet been met, I don't think. But then that's only the opinion of me and you guys so far. So well, obviously lots of other people on social media who immediately sort of express their concern, which I think ties nicely into our final and probably the most brief point, where we've been, well, according to you, Louise, we've been lied to with this very simple flowchart, but it turns out that there are more possible outcomes than there are ways to shuffle a deck of cards, which I thought was impossible. So causing concern, basically, we've got a flowchart that says, has any evaluation other than leadership been graded as causing concern, or has safeguarding been graded as not met? And then yes, if leadership has been graded as causing concern, yes, special measures, no, requires significant improvement. And if the answer to the first question were any other area than leadership was causing concern or not met, then has leadership been graded as causing concern? Yes, significant improvement, no, category for concern. So that's much more simple than 19 million possible options. Did you guys understand this when you got it? Was it helpful? I mean, what is there to say about the causing concern? But this is what we think. This is the roadmap for your school kind of situation. Is that what it is? Because I mean, Louise, you made a very pertinent point about it earlier on, because it's quite a short section in comparison with the rest of it. What were your thoughts on that?
All the parallels that we've drawn with our teaching experience, it feels very much like a child's ending to a story, a bit of a conclusion paragraph. Oh, I finished. Well, did you write the last paragraph? Yes, I did it. You've written 3 sentences. Yeah, that's the end of my writing. That is a very, very glib response to that, isn't it? I apologise to the writers of Proposal 5, which is slightly more than 3 sentences. Maybe I think it's about 6. I've got to say, even a flowchart, and I love a flowchart. I love a bit of the pictorial representation. It does help me a lot. But I still have questions. So I find it hard to understand how this works with some of the other methodology around the close focus on the leadership of the various areas, because they say that every area that they are inspecting will be looked at through a lens of the leadership of that area, and for pupils from disadvantaged backgrounds and with SEND. So there's a clear kind of like, we're going to look at these two things. That seems to come up as a thread time and time again. And I find it hard to understand that if you've got an evaluation area that is graded as causing concern, how does that not impact on leadership being a cause for concern? Now, I have been a senior leader in a number of schools and currently working as a middle leader, subject lead, but I just find that confusing. It's not to be disparaging about school leaders in any way, but I just find that really confusing. It says, has any evaluation area other than leadership been graded as causing concern? If you're grading an area as causing concern, surely that includes and involves school leadership. And I just find that really tricky to get my head around. I find it a bit confusing. I also think, and this is something that I've read about in the NAHT's response to this document, that it doesn't seem to match the legal terminology around the legislation around categories of concern. That the tests don't seem to match up with these definitions. But despite the useful flowchart, I'm still trying to work out what it all means and how it does match up or doesn't match up. It's some very good smoke and mirrors, I think. That is probably what I'm trying to say.
At first, I thought, oh, a flowchart. That will make this really simple. I have to just echo what you said though, Louise, that if any of those areas, and bear with me while I remember what they are: curriculum, developing teaching, achievement, behaviour and attitudes, attendance, personal development and wellbeing, inclusion, safeguarding, early years, sixth form. If any of those have been graded as causing concern, surely that is, like you said, down to leaders. I didn't find the flowchart very helpful after thinking, great, a flowchart. So I wrote down leadership plus another area causing concern, special measures. Safeguarding and leadership causing concern, special measures. An area causing concern requires significant improvement, and leadership as causing concern requires significant improvement. But could you realistically, could you get all of the other areas as better than causing concern if leadership is not? Or could you get leadership as anything other than causing concern if everything else is? I just find it a little bit odd, and I think that's the problem. You've got so many different parts to inspect on. They are all going to join up in different ways, and so I think it will be harder to separate them to an extent in an inspection. So right now we're looking at developing teaching, now we're looking at inclusion, now we're looking at curriculum. They all link together, and yeah, it just feels like it's going to be more complicated in practice when this actually starts happening, because they're all linked up. And like you said, every area goes through the lens of leadership and inclusion. So surely we're going to start seeing the knock-on effect of different areas being causing concern or attention needed. It feels like surely if you've got something like developing teaching or curriculum or inclusion or attendance or behaviour as causing concern, then that's a leadership issue, maybe. Is it? Like you said, I don't want to be disparaging, but someone has led to that, getting to that place. Or maybe leadership in itself should have been taken out as a category, because leadership is in all of the categories, and then it wouldn't be as confusing. We wouldn't need this flowchart then, because it would just be, if an evaluation area If one evaluation area is causing concern, it requires improvement. If multiple are, it's special measures. Even that's going to get confusing. Maybe, realistically, what should have happened is instead of having causing concern, attention needed, secure, I can't remember them all, something else, better than secure, strong, what was it?
Yeah, it was strong than exemplary, wasn't it?
Strong and exemplary, yeah. Maybe you should have just had you're either meeting it or not meeting it, like they've done with safeguarding. Because that, for me, is really simple to go, right, you're either safeguarding your pupils or it's not effective enough. So surely your curriculum is doing what it needs to do or it's not. And your attendance is you're either working on it in a way that works or you're not. And your behaviour is either doing something good or it's not. Why have we got these kind of like woolly areas in between? Which is what I said last week. I just think it should have been either, like, maybe not the words pass or fail, but a yes or a no, a met, a not met. I think it's going to be difficult for people to evaluate themselves, go through the inspection, and maybe it'll be difficult for inspectors to understand it as well. Which, when they've got lots and lots of schools to get through, it's going to be a little bit tricky. Now, to answer your first question, I ended up not finding the flowchart very helpful, despite it looking like it was going to be great.
Going back to the whole numbers game as well, something that's not immediately obvious unless you do think of it in this way is if you take the line from step 1, has any evaluation area other than leadership been graded as causing concern? Just that bit there. And you go to yes. Has leadership been graded as causing concern? No. Requires significant improvement. So you only have to have one area that is causing concern, and it doesn't have to be leadership, to be in requires significant improvement. And there are more areas now. So that increases the chances, that increases not necessarily the likelihood, but that increases the range of options, the range of ways in which a school can be categorised as requiring significant improvement from previous inspection frameworks.
What if that area is attendance as well? Now, totally agree that schools, leaders, trusts can do a lot to work on attendance, in that they can have meetings with parents and send letters, or they employ a company to do those things and monitor their attendance. However, like, attendance is consistently low for all pupils or for groups of pupils and shows little signs of sustained improvement. That's in the causing concern category. That's hard. It's hard to put that on school leaders. I'm not saying that, leaders can't do anything for attendance, because I think you can. You can make your school a place where people want to come to school. But if you are in a school where the culture has been that parents feel like they don't need to bring them in, or pupils don't want to come in, or that is then a way of saying, oh, well, now you require significant improvement, even though it's pretty much out of your hands whether or not people come to school. It just feels a bit icky.
I think we almost had a 7-point scale. Imagine what that would have been like. I think the reason we keep coming back to last week is because this section is indicative of the proposals as a whole. And the phrase that you mentioned, I think last week, Shannen, unintended consequences, it just reeks of unintended consequences the whole way through it. And I really hope we don't sleepwalk as a profession into this, because it's not, our teachers deserve better, our leaders deserve better, our pupils deserve better. I'm all for accountability. I think it's healthy and I think it's needed, but I'm not for teachers doing silly things, schools doing silly things in the name of some unproven, untested approach to school evaluation. Overall, causing concern. So we'll be back with 5 more podcasts in the next 18 months to see how they're getting on. We'll call them monitoring podcasts. And if they still, after 5 monitoring podcasts, haven't sorted this out, well, then we'll do a full 2-episode podcast after 24 months. All that's left to do is say thank you very much for joining me. Thank you very much, Louise.
Thank you, Kieran. Great to be here.
Thank you, Shannen.
Thank you.
And everyone at home, until next time, thanks for listening.